Hello, friend. This is Daryl Mobley, and welcome to Janet TV's Peak Performance Show. It's here that we get the inside info from the nation's leading sports performance experts regarding how athletic and active females can get better, stronger, faster, quicker, more agile, jump higher and farther, throw harder, develop more power, and so much more. Janet TV is the online channel that features female athletes and their sports 24 hours a day at janettv.com. You can get your free subscription to Janet TV's newsletter by going to subscribe.janettv.net. That's subscribe.janettv.net. Today's topic, and it is a big one, is how to prevent, minimize, and treat the epidemic of injuries that female athletes suffer at an alarming rate, higher than that of male athletes. I'm talking about concussions, knee injuries, ankle injuries, hip injuries, lower leg injuries, and shoulder injuries. In a recent article written by Janet TV, we promised to go to experts and get the info you need in order to prevent, minimize, and treat these injuries. We've done so. My guest on today's Peak Performance Show is Brian Lebo. Brian is owner of Athletic Performance Training Center, and he's a certified strength and conditioning specialist. He's also one of Janet TV's experts on athletic performance. Brian can be reached at athleticperformancetc.com. Lean forward and listen up. I also advise you to take notes. Welcome, Brian, to Janet TV's Peak Performance Show. You ready to go?
I am ready to go, Daryl. Thank you.
Perfect. Study after study shows that female athletes suffer certain injuries at a much higher rate than males. And here's some facts, a quick nutshell. Female athletes are at increased risk for overuse injuries to the ankle compared to males. Female athletes are at increased risk for injuries to the hip. Female athletes are at increased risk for injuries to the lower leg. Female athletes are at increased risk for injuries to the knee. We know about ACL and that sort of thing. Female athletes are also at increased risk for injuries to the shoulder. And kind of interesting, female athletes suffer a higher percentage of concussions during games than do males. What I'd like to do is take each injury one by one and get your input on what can be done in each case to A, prevent, B, minimize, and C, kind of treat these injuries. And again, we're not all experts on everything, but my thought, if I can get the top experts on the planet, of which you are one, to provide their input together, we can all put together kind of a package of information that can really help female athletes to suffer less and to enjoy more. So first off, let me just jump right into it. First, let's talk about injuries to the knee. Let's talk about preventing those injuries. What do you have to say on that?
Okay, well, first of all, I just want to say that, despite our best efforts, it's impossible to prevent everything. However, I do believe that we can reduce the incidence of injuries and we can stack the odds in the athlete's favor. And the first thing we really stress in my facility, Daryl, is getting stronger. We want to strengthen the muscle and connective tissue around the joint, and we want to stabilize the joint. So the better balance, the better stability, and we will talk about balance training a little bit, we feel the better chance of reducing injury, especially the knee injury, in the female athletes. Now, that being said, there's a few different theories. There's one that you can't change, and that's hip structure. Obviously, men are built straight up and down. Women, once they hit puberty, widen in the hips, and so there's a little bit of an angle from the hips to the ankles through the knees, which may or may not increase the potential for injury in some women. So we can't do a whole lot about that. However, with regard to strength and balance and stability training, jump and landing mechanics, we've had a lot of success at my facility, knock on wood, utilizing those approaches, I should say, with women. So the first thing is strength training. And one of the things that I really like is what's known as agonist-antagonist paired sets, and that's exercising opposing muscle groups. So, for example, at my facility, every time that we do a hip or a quadricep-oriented exercise, we also do a posterior chain exercise, one that focuses on the glutes and the hamstrings. And the thought is that if you ensure a little more balance between strength in terms of muscle groups, you're better able to stabilize the joint around which the muscles and connective tissue works. And so that's one of our approaches where the knee is concerned. Actually, we do that for every muscle group, Daryl. For the lower body, every time we do a hip quad exercise, we do a glute ham exercise. We do rotational and traditional core exercises, so we're moving in different planes. For the upper body, every time that we push perpendicularly away from the body, as in a bench press or a push-up, we also row. We pull in the same direction toward our body. It's the same thing with vertical exercises. Exercises like a vertical press or a push press. We also make sure that we pair that with a lat pull down or a chin up or pull up, even if the athletes are capable of doing those types of exercises, even with the squat. But where the legs are concerned, getting stronger should be the first order of business to strengthen and stabilize the joint. And I'll just repeat once again, the opposing muscle group paired sets, we believe, and the research really supports, is the way to go. Now, in addition, I think jump and landing mechanics are extremely important. The data indicates that jump mechanics between males and females is different. And, years ago, I don't know if I would have believed that gender makes a difference, but I will say that in training hundreds of boys and girls, men and women, there does seem to be a little bit of a gender difference in the way that athletes land. And the ladies tend to land a little more stiff-legged. So the one thing that we do, once we've built an appropriate foundation of strength, is we start to work on the jump and landing mechanics. And when we land, we want toes pointed straight ahead. We want knees pointed straight ahead. We want knees bent. We want hips down and back. And we want a soft landing using the entire sole of the foot. And we practice that, without jumping off of any kind of plyo box or bench or anything like that. We start doing some just very basic squat, jump, and landings where we have the athletes hold the landing. And so awareness is obviously a big part of what we do, but strengthening and landing mechanics are probably the two most important things that we do at our facility to protect against knee injuries, especially in the female athlete.
All right, let's take a quick break. You're listening to Janet TV's Peak Performance Show. Today's topic, how to prevent, minimize, and treat the epidemic of injuries afflicting female athletes. Be sure and visit janettv.com. I've got to ask you, I'm a big believer in always admitting my ignorance. You said posterior chain. What does that mean?
Correct. Well, when we talk about posterior chain, we're talking about the muscles that run from about the lower back through the glutes, through the hamstrings, and even into the calves. And, everything we do is very quadricep oriented. When we walk up steps, I see guys and girls in high school weight rooms and rec facilities and at the YMCA, and they focus on leg presses and they focus on squats and they do a lot of those types of exercises, but commensurately, they don't really work the posterior chain very well. And so, when you have a very strong muscle in the front of your leg exerting a force on the knee every time you move the knee linearly, laterally, etc., and you have a relatively weaker muscle that can't really balance the force of that quadricep muscle, the research would indicate that may make you a little more prone to injury. And so your hamstrings are never going to be as strong as your quadriceps. Your quadriceps are the biggest, strongest muscles basically that you have in your body. But we can work on balancing those forces a little better. So when we talk about posterior chain and those muscle groups and the exercises that we would use, we're talking about back hyperextensions. We're talking about glute ham raises, which are also known as Nordic hamstring curls. We're talking about Romanian deadlifts with barbells or dumbbells. We're talking about Swiss ball or physio ball hamstring curls. Those are the types of exercises that we utilize every single time we work out, because once again, every time we do a hip quad exercise, like a bench, like a leg press or a squat, we balance it with one of those exercises and more that I just mentioned.
Okay, all right. So let's say the knee has been injured, or somebody comes in and they've had trouble with their knee you know, and maybe this goes into, I want to talk about minimizing the impact of the injury and maybe treating the injury as well. But what do you do? Say come in, a young lady, a woman, a female athlete walks in the door. She's had knee problems in the past. You know, maybe she's had a ACL, you know, blow up of some sort. What do you do? How do you help her minimize the impact?
That's a good question. We have worked with everyone from, you know, minor non-surgically repaired knee injuries all the way to more severe knee injuries where there has been a rupture or a tear of the ACL, the MCL, the meniscus, et cetera. And so, you know, the first thing that we do is we want to ensure that these folks have been through some sort of physical therapy, because what we do, the strength and conditioning that we do, is what follows the physical therapy. And so, you know, all of these folks really should see a qualified orthopedist. They should see a physical therapist, because we want to make sure that they have clearance to do the types of exercises that we want to start for strengthening. And bottom line is, I want to make sure that there are no restrictions. I know when we first start working with post-ACL or post-knee injury individuals, athletes, one of the things that we want to make sure that we do is we want to talk with the physical therapist, because a lot of times they want us to avoid impact, you know, up and down off their feet. We want them to avoid lateral movement initially. Everything has to be very low intensity, maybe body weight if possible, and they want it to be extremely functional. So they don't want to do exercises like leg lifts or leg extensions or extending the foot, you know, way in front of the knee. They want everything to be balanced over the center of gravity, squats, single leg squats, split squats, some leg presses, those sorts of things. And so when athletes do come to us, like I said, I'm going to say it again because I think it's really important. You know, they should have seen a team trainer at least, if not a team doctor, orthopedist, et cetera. And there should also, depending on the severity of the knee injury, there should have been some physical therapy involved that works on restoring and regaining range of motion before you even worry about strength training. But once they're cleared and they're ready for strength training, you know, we treat them the way we would almost any other athletes, with restrictions. There may be impact restrictions, lateral movement restrictions, and of course the intensity level at which we work, meaning the amount of weight we use, the number of sets and repetitions, may be geared more toward their needs. But, you know, everything else remains roughly the same once they're cleared of restrictions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. And that goes, because that's minimize the impact of the injury. Is there something, so let's, if a person has had an injury, come into, you've had many people come in, they have this leg has been damaged. And so once they're cleared to do certain things, and you simply put them on a program, much as you would to prevent the problem in the first place, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
So we not only want to strengthen, but we want to make sure that we incorporate future injury prevention strategies. And, you know, that's where stuff like the opposing, you know, muscle group paired sets comes into play, as well as, when they're ready for it, the landing mechanics to reduce the impact injuries. And so, you know, we put them on a plan that really is multifaceted and takes into account the feedback from physician, orthopedist, team trainer, physical therapist, et cetera. So it's really it's really something where we encourage feedback from other specialists as part of the athlete's rehabilitation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Let's talk about injuries to the ankles. Injuries to the ankles. Mm-hmm. What do we do to prevent those?
Well, I'll tell you, ankles are tough. It takes a while to come back from ankles. And so in terms of prevention, I'll tell you some of the things that we do. The first thing that we do is, once again, we want to strengthen the muscle and connective tissue around the ankle. And so we like calf raises a whole lot. We do them a few different ways. We do them with 2 feet at a very slow pace with some pauses. We do them single leg. We do them 2 feet at a very rapid pace. We also do an isometric hold in the upper position of a calf raise for some, you know, finite period of time. And, you know, calf raises, I know a lot of people do them for their calves, and, you know, that may or may not be what someone's interested in. But, you know, at our facility, we do them for the basketball players, the soccer players, the volleyball players, football, et cetera, all the players who are at higher risk for an ankle injury because of the impact that they have on strengthening the muscle and connective tissue around the ankle. Now, very low intensity plyometrics, like skipping rope, also has a very nice effect on strengthening the muscle around the foot and ankle. And then the last thing that we do is most of my athletes end virtually every training session doing some ankle stability exercise. And there have been some studies that show these types of ankle stability exercises that I'm going to describe help to reduce ankle injuries in athletes by as much as about 40%. And so what we use at my facility, Daryl, is we use something called an AirX balance pad. It's a foam pad that's probably about 2.5 inches thick, and it's rectangular in shape. And so what these athletes do, 1 foot at a time, is we start off with a minute on each foot. They actually balance on it, and it creates an unstable surface. We have them take off their shoes because we don't want the sole of their shoe helping to stabilize them, and we also want them to stay nice and still and quiet with their upper body. So in other words, we don't want them to use their hands and arms to stabilize themselves. And what happens is, your athletes can do this at home. They can take a bath towel, fold it in half, half again, and half one more time, and stand on it in bare feet or in socks. And what you're going to find when you balance on 1 foot is your ankle is going to wobble a little bit back and forth. And that's kind of the purpose of this exercise, because what this exercise does is teach something called proprioception, which is just a $5 word. What these types of exercises do, this type of balance training, is it teaches, quote unquote, your ankle to adapt to a roll. It teaches your ankle to adapt to instability, and you can teach that type of muscle memory so that when you get into practice or game conditions, you have a lower incidence or a lower likelihood of rolling the ankle. And we do that. We start with about a minute on each foot, and we work up to about 2 or 3 minutes on each foot 2 or 3 times a week. And so, I know some people use like a Bosu ball or something like that. That's a little too unstable in our opinion. And so we use, like I said, this little blue AirX balance pad. You can get them through, strength and fitness supply websites and that sort of thing. But we've had a lot of luck. And as I mentioned, ankle stability training is a component part of almost every athlete's workout every time they're at our facility.
Wow. Wow, fantastic. Well, what about the ankle injury? Somebody comes in, they're all jacked up, ankle's been jacked up, and I don't know, I guess there's the person who's currently suffering from it, or those, in volleyball, you see a lot of young women wearing braces all the time. So,
right.
What I guess there's the person currently, they did it, the leg is hurting, the ankle is hurting. How do you treat that? And then, of course, there's the person who's had a long-term, well, at some point in their life they had an incident, and maybe they're now wearing these ankle braces all the time. What do you do such that their legs, get strong again or new or whatever?
Well, once again, we're not really in the business of treating injuries, but when people come in post-ankle injury, the first thing that we want to know is, what restrictions do they have? What can they do? What can't they do? And right off the bat, when someone suffers an ankle injury, and I'm working with a few folks right now who are working through some sprained ankles, some rolled ankles, and the first thing that we do is we limit, if not eliminate, the lateral stuff and the impact stuff. So, where my athletes may usually do some plyometrics, some skipping rope, that sort of thing, that puts a lot of undue stress on an injured ankle. And so, what we want to do as much as possible, believe it or not, to begin strengthening the ankle is we want to do some of those lower extremity strength exercises like squats, even single leg squats, leg presses, single leg presses that require strength and stabilization of the ankle as it relates to everything else that they're doing in the chain with their hips and knees, okay? So we won't do anything overtly for the ankle immediately. If the athlete is capable of doing it without pain, and I stress that, we'll resume with some body weight calf raises, and then we'll move forward as we can. But, we're a little careful with ankles because ankle injuries tend to persist. And, with regard to the ankle braces, there's a lot of different schools of thought on that. I will tell you that I have a brother-in-law who's the chief of foot and ankle orthopedics at the Cleveland Clinic, and he's nationally known, and he's not a big fan of wearing ankle braces for prophylaxis, okay, for prevention. However, you know, he does acknowledge that there is a place for ankle braces, although they don't prevent all re-injury from occurring, but there is a place for stabilization of the ankle where ankle braces can be helpful. He also acknowledges that there's probably a little bit of a psychological effect. You know, my son was a very good basketball player, all-state shooting guard, and the fall before his junior season, he suffered a pretty bad sprain of one of his ankles, and he started wearing an ankle brace. And by the time he was midway through his junior season, he wore ankle braces on both ankles throughout the rest of his high school career and into college. Now, Eric worked really hard on strengthening his ankles, and I think his ankles are probably as strong now as they ever were. However, I do believe there was a little bit of a psychological effect and benefit for Eric in having those ankle braces on following, you know, what was a pretty severe sprain of the ankle. So, you know, where ankle braces are concerned, post-injury, we think they may be helpful, both physically and psychologically. But as far as prevention or to guard against ankle injuries, we're really not a big fan of the ankle braces. Another thing, another mistake that some kids and even parents make is, you know, when they start wearing the ankle braces, they stop strengthening the ankle, okay, and they become a little too dependent on that artificial means of ankle stability. You know, what we want these athletes to do is we want them to form more of a natural joint stability around all of their joints by strengthening their muscles and connective tissue, and not by depending on braces or splints or whatever the case may be.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Okay, excellent. All right. Goodness. Well, let's talk about the hip. But this is the interesting area. The injuries to the hip. For some reason, women suffer at a higher rate this area than males. What about that? How do we prevent those sorts of injuries?
Well, you know, a couple of different things. Strength exercise and range of motion and mobility exercises. And once again, you know, we have worked with post-rehab hips. You know, I have one young lady who's a very successful college soccer player who had a little bit of a growth plate issue with one of her hips that was causing a lot of pain. And, you know, once again, she's a sophomore in college now, so she's more or less grown out of it. But, you know, we had to be very careful with Katie, and we had to ensure that we were doing things at the right intensity level for her. We communicated with the physical therapist, but as far as hip exercises are concerned, you know, we want to do exercises that initiate through the hips, you know, triple extension exercises, whether that is, you know, deadlifts, and the intensity level is going to depend on what the athlete can bear, but, you know, deadlifts and squats, Romanian deadlifts, hip extensions, where, you know, you're lying down on your back and your feet are on top of a Swiss ball or a physio ball, and you elevate your hips and then lower your hips, and you can do those laterally as well. So, you know, those types of exercises, as well as mobility, range, and motion exercises, which are, they're not really stretching exercises, Daryl. It would be something like a modified lunge with a twist, for example. It's kind of difficult to describe without being able to demonstrate it for you. But for the hips, we think, you know, like every other joint, we want to strengthen the muscle and connective tissue around it. And then obviously, you know, your hip bends a little differently than your knee bends. And so with the hip, we have a little more latitude to do some mobility, range of motion, flexibility exercises that we are limited where the knee joint is concerned.
Okay. All right, then. I got you. Very nice. Okay. All right. Just so I know, what type of, you know, maybe you can give me a recent pick of the type of hip problems, because my mind is, I'm trying to understand, what type of hip problems have you seen maybe recently or just looking back in times among, I guess, women in particular or people in general who come in? Is it problems of concussion, like getting hit, or can there be twists and turns and whatever going on?
Well, you know, we haven't seen a lot of them, frankly. We have seen a few impact injuries, and there's a couple of football players that come to mind where there have been a few impact injuries. As far as wear and tear and overuse, we don't see nearly the volume of hip injuries as we do with knees and especially ankles. And so, you know, where the hips are concerned, you know, there's occasionally like like a muscle strain. You know, a lot of times what we see, Daryl, is a lot more groin related than it is actually hip related, but it certainly is possible to strain a hip muscle or to injure a hip muscle. But, you know, we don't see a whole lot of that as a result of stress or overuse. The hip injuries that we've seen have been more about impact, whether that's, you know, impact in football with another player or even impact with the ground. You know, there's a soccer player that we train who actually injured his hip, and it was a, you know, it was going after a ball that he was trying to head her, and legs got tangled up, and the way he fell was a little bit awkward, and he actually injured the muscles of his hips through a fall.
Wow. Wow. That's got to be very painful. Very painful. Okay. All right, then. Okay, let's talk about the lower leg, I guess. We talked about the ankle in particular, but lower leg problems, injuries to that. What do we do to prevent those?
Well, you know, once again with the ankles, I come back to strengthening through our calf raises and balance and stability training on the AirX balance pad. Now, you know, I really believe that if and when the athlete can progress into impact exercises like something as easy as jumping rope or more preferably plyometric exercises, I think those are great for building joint strength and stability in the lower extremities. Now, with novices, we tend not to start out with plyometrics, or if we do, they're at a very, very low intensity level because we want to build a proper foundation of strength before we start getting these kids up and down off their feet. And for post-injury, we're also very careful because impact can aggravate an existing injury. And so, you know, once again, with the lower extremities, it's got to be about strengthening the muscle and connective tissue. You want to be movement-oriented as well. And so one of the things that I should have mentioned at the outset is you want to be careful about training muscles and you want to train movements. Okay, that's how you can that's also an injury prevention strategy. Now, I won't argue that when it comes to rehab, sometimes you have to strengthen muscles. Sometimes it's not quite as functional and movement-oriented because you have to help to restore mobility, strength to a muscle that is atrophied, that is stiffened a little bit. But the bottom line is, you know, focusing on movement-oriented exercises instead of simply muscle-oriented exercises is another great injury prevention strategy, especially for the legs and lower legs.
Wow. Okay. Excellent. Any additional things you do if there's been an injury, or if you are, you know, if you are maybe suffered an injury in the past and you want to limit the opportunity for you to have to re-injure? Is there anything different than the prevention stuff you lay out for us?
No, there's really not. You know, the bottom line is, once again, you can't prevent everything, but there are some injuries where you can stack the odds in your favor by doing some movement-oriented training, by strengthening the muscle and connective tissue around the joints, by stabilizing the joint with balance and stability exercises, doing some movement and impact-oriented exercise. And so, you know, those are the types of things that, whether you're talking about prevention and or I should say, you know, post-injury rehab, those are the types of things that that the research supports.
Okay, fair enough. Let's talk about the shoulder. We got the softball players, we got the volleyball players, we've got javelin, discus, folks of all sorts who suffer from these sorts of injuries at a high rate, and certainly women in general. How do we prevent those things as best we can?
Another good question. So, you know, this is going to sound a little counterintuitive, but the first thing that we do is we make sure these athletes are strong through the core and the legs. There's a lot of research, for example, softball players, that shows that bat speed is not necessarily dependent on upper body strength and power. It's the core and the lower body. The same goes for throwing athletes, whether that's softball players, whether that's shot and disc, etc. So the first thing we do is we understand what the literature is talking about when they say that strengthening your core and lower body, which is where the majority of your power comes from, helps to lessen the torque produced by the shoulder when throwing athletes throw. And so once again, it's not always real intuitive because, you know, people think about strengthening the upper body, strengthening the shoulder, stabilizing the shoulder, and I will get into that in a minute because we do that. However, what the research demonstrates is almost first and foremost, a great injury prevention strategy for shoulders is strengthening the core and the lower extremities. And so that's kind of the cornerstone of what we do. Now, that being said, strengthening the upper body is important. And, you know, what we want to achieve, once again, is a little bit of balance and parity of muscle strength across the joint. And so for the upper body, when we do an exercise like bench press or push-ups, we want to pair that with an exercise that rows toward the body. With some athletes, we're a little careful about the overhead exercise that they do. And so another strategy, not only for strengthening, but for injury prevention as well as rehab, is light dumbbell shoulder raises, band work, where we're doing some shoulder mobility exercises with the band. And so we do pay attention because, you know, there are some small muscles, the rotator cuff, the labrum that houses the shoulder joint, that can be susceptible to injury, and the injuries can be tough to come back from. You know, a couple of baseball players in high school that I trained, one of them tore his labrum diving for a ground ball, so it was an impact injury. Another one of them tore a labrum sliding head first into a base early in the spring when the ground was still a little wet, and he just kind of stuck. He didn't slide.
Oh boy!
And so, you know, it took these kids a while to come back from the injury. And these were both very, very good high school baseball players, both with college aspirations. You know, the young man who tore his labrum sliding, we actually strengthened him and worked with him for the better part of the next year, and he went on to play college baseball. You know, the other gentleman, same thing, physical therapy, and he was never able to work through a little bit of pain and discomfort when he was swinging the bat. It just never quite came back. And, you know, we're not real sure if that was just a post-surgery thing or, you know, what the deal was, but different people come back differently, obviously. And so I guess I'm just getting away from your question a little bit, but just to recap, the first thing that athletes should look at if they want to reduce and prevent against shoulder injuries is strengthening the muscles that allow them to reduce the torque that their shoulder produces, and that's the muscles that go from your hips through your legs. Hips, glutes, hamstrings, lower back, core, etc. And then you also want to take care of some of the small muscles around the shoulder as well. As I mentioned, dumbbell shoulder raises, some band exercises, etc. But
all right, let's take a quick break. You're listening to Janet TV's Peak Performance Show. Today's topic: how to prevent, minimize, and treat the epidemic of injuries afflicting female athletes. Be sure and visit janettv.com.
You know, at our facility, whether we're talking about upper or lower body, and the research supports this approach, you know, we believe it all begins with the legs. It all begins with the core and lower extremities.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything, you know, this is kind of going a little bit away from, is there anything you should not do? Any particular exercise or weight workout or whatever that you say a person who's suffering from shoulders, don't do this? You know, maybe something that's popular to do, you shouldn't do this. Anything that you can think of in that area?
Well, you know, I mean, I'll start from the top. And with the shoulder injuries, I think you want to stay away from pushing things over your head. Okay, so the barbell, the vertical press, the dumbbell presses, those sorts of things. There's really not a reason to do those things, or at least to do them with significant weight. You know, pushing weight over your head is a little bit of an unnatural range of motion, and so where the shoulders are concerned, we're a little careful about that. There's a lot of good exercises that we can do, and I've mentioned a few of them, to strengthen the muscles around the shoulder without pushing weight over your head. Where the hips are concerned, depending on, you know, the nature of the hip injury, you want to be a little bit careful with impact. Okay, and the same goes with the knee and the ankle for that matter. As we travel down the leg to the knee, you want to be careful when you're doing exercises where you're extending the foot away from the center of gravity. So the seated leg extension or leg lift, or the prone hamstring curl. We don't even have those machines in my facility because
wait a minute. So wait. This is interesting. The seat weight. So the leg extension, which is you see that in virtually every gym. The leg curl. Yeah, I know. It's like, you're saying that's something that you say, hey, if you don't have it, that's a strong statement. You don't advise people to do that exercise?
Correct. There's better exercises. There's more functional exercises. I mean, if you take a look at that, and once again, this goes back to training movements and not muscles, Daryl. If you take a look at the motion that you use when you do that leg extension, where you're sitting, your knee is over the pad, and you're lifting a weight with your lower leg, your ankle, that sort of thing. It's not really a movement you use in any sport, and the same thing goes with the prone hamstring curl. Lying on your back and bringing your heels up, toward your back end. And so, what the research shows is that I'm not going to say that they're bad exercises. I don't want to call anybody's baby ugly. If you use those exercises, great. If you don't, great. However, the research pretty capably shows that there are some better alternatives to leg extensions and leg curls. And
okay, wait a minute. What are they? I'm writing down right now. Tell me some alternatives to that.
Well, I'll tell you the exercise that we use in my facility, and once again, these are exercises that are supported by the research. Bilateral exercises, 2 legs, we really like the squat, the leg press, and the split squat, okay? Now, when it comes to unilateral exercises, we like the single leg squat, we like the single leg press, we like the step up using a plyo box, and we also use the Bulgarian split squat, which is like a split squat with the rear leg elevated. And so those exercises, hip quad exercises, are exercises that we really like. And we would use any of those in place for the seated leg extension. Now, where the prone hamstring curl is concerned, we like back extensions and reverse hyperextensions. We like bilateral and unilateral Romanian deadlifts. We like glute ham raises, or Nordic hamstring curls as they're also known, which are one of the best exercises for strengthening and injury prevention of the hamstrings. Swiss ball hamstring curls or Swiss ball hip extensions. Bilateral or unilateral, 1 leg or 2, we like those exercises as well. And so I would and do obviously substitute any of those exercises in place of seated leg extensions and prone hamstring curls. Once again, we don't even have those machines in my facility.
Wow. Now I'm spinning off into a whole other area here, because now you can okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask you, I was going to say make you, I can't make you do anything, but I'm going to ask you if you're one, I'm going to go down each of these areas of the body and say, okay, Brian, you're the first or the one most fantastic exercise you have someone do is, and I know there are different ones, they do different things, but if you want on hey, you're on an island, they say you can only do one exercise for your knee, what would that be?
One exercise.
One, only one. I know they're going to do, everyone listening, you'll do more than one, but I'm just, if there's only one.
So we can't incorporate the opposing muscle group strategy, and we can't pick 2. You just want one.
One.
I would have to say probably the glute ham raise.
Wow.
The Nordic hamstring curl. Okay. Because, once again, you kind of put me on the spot. I wouldn't choose one because I think it's real important to pair the hip quad and the glute ham. So I would pair the squat with the Nordic hamstring curl or the glute ham raise. However, there's a lot of folks through their normal activity, they're going to get some to much activation of the quadricep muscle through the running, the jumping of their sport, etc. But not necessarily as much of the posterior chain. So where the knee is concerned, if you're looking to add one exercise, help increase your odds of staying healthy, of injury prevention for female athletes especially, I would say add the glute ham raise, the Nordic hamstring curl.
I like the way you do that. If you're going to add one, I like that. That's very good. So let's say that. Okay, how about to the ankle? Hey, you're going to add one. You can only add one exercise for the ankle to help prevent and all that other wonderful stuff. What would it be?
Yep. Well, there's a lot of people out there who are already working their ankles without even knowing it through running, jumping. Maybe there's people who are doing, you know, calf raises, etc. So I would add the ankle stability, the balance exercise that we talked about on the Bosu balance pad. That's what I'd add. I would add some balance training, starting with 1 minute on each foot in either bare feet or socks on an unstable surface 2 to 3 times a week, and work up to 2 to 3 minutes 2 to 3 times a week on each foot.
Wow. I'm writing this down, times per week. Write it down, everyone, per week. Okay. All right. Now, what about to the hip? 1. You can only add 1. Everything you're doing a lot of
one
stuff?
Exercise. Then I would probably do a hip extension. Okay. And so what I mean by a hip extension is I would do an exercise where I'm going from a flexed position to an extended position with my hip. And I would say the traditional deadlift would be the exercise that I would incorporate into a training regimen, as long as it was appropriately coached, supervised with regard to form, technique, mechanics, etc. A lot of people do the deadlift incorrectly. They start descending by bending the knees, when in fact they should be doing it by pushing their hips backward and then forcefully driving their hips forward as they bring the weight back up. So I would say, you know, aside from an exercise like a hip extension, I would say the traditional deadlift would be a great bang for the buck for hip strengthening and injury prevention.
Okay, all right. Now to the, I guess, the generic lower leg, which I guess let's exclude the ankle from this discussion. The lower leg, so somewhere from below the knee, above, I guess, at the calf, and maybe what would you add?
Calf raises. That's a simple one. You know, fortunately or unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can do for that area of the body, because that musculature is almost totally impacted by what you do with your foot and ankle. Okay, so it's got to be a foot and ankle exercise for any musculature from the knee down. And so, you know, I would have to say calf raises. You can do them however you want. You know, 2 leg, 1 leg, isometric holds. You know, rapidly, slowly with pauses. You could alternate from time to time, but just very broadly, I would say calf raises would be the exercise I would add.
Okay, all right. Now onto the shoulder. What would you add for the shoulder? This is kind of exciting.
That's a good question. I would say dumbbell shoulder raises.
Okay.
And there's a few different ways you can do them. Now, with dumbbell shoulder raises, basically you're taking a pair of dumbbells and you're holding them down at your sides with your palms facing down. You can raise them up in front of you. You can raise them to the side of you. You can raise them a little bit behind you, or you can raise them at a 45-degree angle, kind of splitting the difference between in front of you and on the side of you. It's more like what they call a scapular raise.
Okay.
And so I would say light to moderate weight dumbbell shoulder raises would be probably the thing that I would add for most rowing athletes to help stabilize some of the small muscles around the shoulder. Once again, I'm going to repeat because I think it bears repeating, core and lower extremity training is critical for throwing athletes to reduce torque on the shoulder. But when you're talking about strengthening the shoulder, a lot of different exercises that you can do. You know, obviously bench presses and rows and vertical presses and lat pull downs. But, you know, given that you see those machines all over the place and people do them anywhere, you know, getting back to our theme, the exercise that I would add to a training regimen is the light to moderate weight dumbbell shoulder raises.
Now, you've emphasized light to moderate weight. So are you saying that, and I'm asking you, is heavy weight inappropriate for these sorts of things?
Correct.
I see guys out there trying to throw heavy weight. It isn't appropriate.
Correct.
Okay.
Once again, you know, you're extending your arms, especially your hands, up and away from your center of gravity. So you want to be a little careful there. You don't want to overdo it. And the effectiveness of this exercise is perfectly fine using a light to moderate weight.
Okay. Okay. All right. Perfect. All right. Now let's move on to kind of our final area, a tricky area of concussions. And you know,
Sure.
I've long, you know, once I discovered that, you know, females suffer from this at a higher rate, and of course we hear a lot about concussions, but I've long said, you know, there's stuff we can't control. You know, if the head hits something at a certain force or snap back, you know, as far as what happens inside the brain and what it, okay. But there have to be some things we can do that, you know, to help prevent them from happening or lower the possibility that a concussion happens. So, with that said, and putting it into squarely on your shoulders, what can be done there, do you think?
Well, once again, I'll just say neck strengthening exercises. You know, you hit it right on the head. There's a lot of people who, you know, they want safer helmets and more padding and this and that. And don't get me wrong, that's important. However, you know, you alluded to this just a second ago. It's really not about the impact of something against the head. It's the impact that causes that the brain undergoes against the inside of the skull. Okay, that's what causes the concussion. And so the bottom line is, whether it's an impact that's helmet against helmet or head against the ground, you know, when you jar your head and you jar, you know, basically your brain, it causes some injury, it causes some bruising, and that's kind of the basis of the concussion. And so, you know, you and I touched on this just very superficially on our last interview, and there is some research that shows that that a realistic and reasonable injury prevention strategy is strengthening the muscles around the neck to lessen the I think you even mentioned the whiplash effect of the head snapping back, you know, against the ground or against, you know, the basketball court surface or whatever the case may be. And so neck strengthening exercises are important. Now, there's a couple of different ways you could do those. In a lot of high school weight rooms, they actually have neck machines where you know, you're actually pushing against some resistance forward, backward, and to both sides. Okay. Another way you can do this, and there was a study I read just recently, is, you know, you lie down on a bench, face down on your stomach, so that only your head is hanging over the bench. And then you put a towel on the back of your head, and you place a 10-pound weight plate on top of the towel, and you hold it with both hands. So, you know, both your hands are basically supporting this weight on top of your head. And then what you do is you lower your head and raise your head, because your head isn't supported by the bench. The rest of your body is, obviously. And so it's a real simple exercise that athletes can do. It doesn't work all planes of motion. But if you want to work all planes of motion and you don't have easy access to a neck machine, you know, you could do it yourself by, you know, pushing against either your hand, both forward and backward, as well as from side to side, or you could stand against a wall and put a pillow or something against a wall and push against it. And so it would be more isometric in nature, but that's another way that you can exercise the muscles around the neck. And, you know, what the research shows to some extent is, over time, the development of the musculature around the neck can help to lessen the impact or the snap or the whiplash effect of contact. And it can potentially help to reduce the incidence of concussions. And once again, you know, concussions, as you mentioned, are just, I don't know if they're an increasing problem nowadays, Daryl, or if they're just getting a lot more attention, media sensationalizing, you know, head injuries, and of course what happened in the NFL, the big lawsuit and the big payout, that sort of thing. So, and you know, there may have been some people in the past who had concussions that were either under or undiagnosed that you know, played through it over time. And, you know, you've read about the impact of these folks when they get older, and the traumatic, post-traumatic, you know, stress injuries, post-traumatic concussion syndrome, et cetera, for boxers and football players, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, once again, it's an increasing problem. I think the awareness level is better now than it ever has been. You know, even at our high school, we pre-test athletes, and following any kind of head injury or even potential concussion, they have to go back in and they have to take a test, and they have to score within some standard deviation of their healthy test. And it tests, you know, memory, recall, retention, reflexes, et cetera. And this type of software is being used at high school and colleges all over the place. But once again, in answer to your question, there's not a whole lot of latitude that we have as it relates to concussions because of the nature of concussions. But it seems as though strengthening the muscles around the head and neck in the ways that we discussed may be useful in helping to reduce some of the incidence of the concussion injury.
Okay. Excellent, excellent. All right. Well, let me throw this at you. I've gone through the areas that we promised, our audience that we would cover. But in thinking about injuries to female athletes, is there anything I haven't covered that you think I should? Any area left untouched, or something you wanted to say that might be beneficial to those who are listening and viewing and that sort of thing?
No, I really don't think so. I think what we covered was pretty thorough. Once again, I am not necessarily a definitive expert on all things strength and conditioning, but hopefully, given the research that's available, I'm somewhat knowledgeable. And I just really think that strengthening and stabilizing the joint is important. Strengthening, obviously, through weight training, and strengthening the muscle and the connective tissue around the joint. Stabilizing the joint by doing some balance training, especially where it's applicable with the lower extremities. I think those things are extremely important. And then, once again, landing mechanics. I think that's a little bit undervalued, and there's a lot of people that realize the benefit of the strength and the stability, but, the landing mechanics are a little bit of the problem. I mean, there's a lot of ACL injuries in women that have nothing to do with impact except the impact of the way they come down awkwardly against the ground. And so I think, landing mechanics and reteaching proper muscle memory can be very, very useful. And, I think if you incorporate all those elements, you really give the athlete a fighting chance. Once again, understanding that you can't prevent everything, but put it this way. If I were placing a bet on athletes and which would stay injury-free, my bet would be placed on the ones who are doing the strength and stability training, the landing mechanics, the balance exercises, etc. I think the research bears out that that you're better off doing those things than not doing those things when it comes to injury prevention.
Wow. Well, first of all, let me say this to everyone, that Brian kind of undersold himself. I don't know that anyone is the ultimate voice on all things injury when it comes to athletes, female athletes in particular. But I can tell you that Brian he has certainly met our standard which is a high standard for knowledge, for ability to communicate his knowledge about performance issues, about athletic performance. Yes, he's a certified strength and conditioning specialist. He's all those wonderful things. He runs his own facility, about all that. So he is a person that you can rely on for information. And my hope is that someone out there has learned some things that prevent the next injury or lessen the impact when they've had. Brian, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for all that you've given us and what you've shared. And we'll make sure we get this information out there. And again, folks, feel free to access Brian Lebo. You can find out about him certainly at Janet TV. You can go online and search his name. You can go to the Athletic Performance Training Center or athleticperformancetc.com and find out all about it. Thanks, Brian. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to Janet TV's Peak Performance Show. Be sure and visit Janet TV at janettv.com. It is there that you'll find all the information you could ever want about female athletes and their sports. We also invite feedback. So you can go there, you can feedback to us in writing or via the various contact ways we have there. And we'd love to have you as part of the Janet TV family. This has been Daryl Mosley with Janet TV, janettv.com.